Hey everybody, Professor Carafit coming to you from my biology bunker, secret underground lair where I shall now lecture to you about biology from afar. Today we are going to talk just a very brief video on natural selection from chapter 1 of the textbook. This is the fundamental concept that unites all of biology. Without evolution by natural selection, nothing makes sense in biology. So that's quite quite an important topic then. So this is just an introduction here. I'm not going to make you memorize anyone on this slide, but I want you to be familiar with them. Evolution was not invented or discovered, if you will, by Charles Darwin. People thought organisms had been changing since the time of the Greeks. Here we see in the upper corner Plato and Aristotle, who had ideas about organisms changing. But the first more modern idea of evolution was put forth not by Charles, but by Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who had an idea of how organisms might change. Now, he didn't know exactly how it would work, and he wasn't quite right, but that's, as we already have talked about, that's how science works. Later on came Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who thought organisms evolved through this thing known as acquired characteristics, where, for example, a giraffe would stretch its neck trying to eat leaves on a tree, and therefore it would have babies with longer necks. That's how he thought evolution worked, and that makes sense based on what he could observe and what he knew about organisms, but it turns out to not have the correct mechanism. Also, at the same time, actually a little bit after Charles Darwin discovered natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace came up with a concept that was pretty much the same as Charles Darwin's, which forced Darwin to publish his works. Darwin discovered it, he wrote about it, and then kind of put it on a shelf and didn't share it with the world because he was worried about how it would be accepted by the world, because it changed the fundamental ideas from for example, the Earth being 5,000 years old, and everything in Europe, at least, the Bible being exactly how it worked. He shook that up a bit by saying, well, I have evidence that things work differently, and he was worried about how that would be accepted. So he didn't publish it right away, but Alfred Russel Wallace came up with the same ideas, and Alfred wasn't worried about publishing it. He was going to publish it, but he shared it with Darwin, and Darwin said, oh crap, I need to publish my paper now too. And they both published their papers at the same time on the same day. Now, what Darwin really figured out was that life was unified. There is unity in life, and there's great diversity in life, and he was able to explain that through the theory of evolution by natural selection. So what do we mean by that? Life is unified. Here we see several birds. They all share traits in common, but they're also very diverse. The penguin, the flamingo, and the hawk are very diverse, and they've adapted to different ways of living. All life is also related in that we all have DNA, we all have cells, we all share certain traits in common. We are all unified in those basic fundamental building blocks. One thing I do want to point out is that evolution is not the study of how life began. That's a separate field of study called abiogenesis. Evolution is the study of how life changes, and that's what Darwin figured out, is this probable explanation for how it works, which has since become a theory, meaning it's as close to proved as we get in the sciences. Now, how does it work? It's actually pretty simple, and pretty amazingly, we can see that not only does it make sense, it would be hard for it not to work. It would be harder to see a population not evolve over time than to have a population actually evolve over time. So what is required in a population? Number one, on the left there, well, yeah, on the left, populations with varied inherited traits. So populations have to have heritable traits, heritable variation. They have to have different traits that they inherit in their DNA. Now, Darwin didn't know about DNA or genes, but he knew you could inherit traits from your parents. So in this beetle population, we see dark beetles, light beetles, and kind of gray beetles, right? They're varied, they're variable, they have diversity. That diversity is absolutely necessary for evolution. You should write that down. Inherited variation is necessary for evolution by natural selection. Then number 2, elimination of individuals with certain traits. Well, some individuals that are born have traits that work really well, and some traits don't work really well. The ones that have traits that don't work really well are maybe like turtles running to the ocean. They're slower. They are maybe they're easier to see on the sand or whatever. They're eaten faster. In this case of the beetle population, some beetles are darker and hide better. Some are lighter and stand out easier, and they're more easily eaten by the bird. So that is what natural selection is. Some traits just work better and have more babies than other traits. That is natural selection. Okay? Some individuals have traits that let them have more babies and influence the next generation more than other individuals. So, elimination of certain traits occurs. It doesn't have to be a predator. It could just be that they're able to find food more easily, they're able to attract mates more easily, etc. Number 3, survivors reproduce. So those that survive being eaten have lots of babies. And then number 4, then the traits that worked really well increase in frequency. And that's how a population adapts to an environment. But you give that enough time, and you separate one population from another, and they adapt in different ways, that leads then to what we see on the bottom is speciation. Organisms that adapt to their own unique habitats so much that when you bring them back together again, they don't mate with each other because they have become different species. And we'll talk a lot more about that in Bio 2, but we will bring this up over and over again in Bio 1 because it is the fundamental unifying concept of all biology. And I'm going to share with you an extra video that I ask you to watch, but I won't put any test questions on about the discovery of the theory of evolution by natural selection.